Throughout a season of riding, our bikes can take quite a bit of abuse. Although they are meant to handle it, it's important to do what we can to keep it operating smoothly. In this episode, I take a look at cleaning and replacing the pivot bearings of a rear suspension mountain bike. The pivot bearings ensure efficient transfer of energy from the rear wheel to the shock. Although the bearings are sealed, water or dirt can still get inside. This causes them to not rotate quite as smoothly, and eventually they could even seize up. I first did a quick and rough assessment of the bearings by cycling through all of the travel in the rear suspension. To do this, I removed some of the air from the rear shock in order to make it easier to cycle the suspension through its travel. Then cycling through the travel and feeling if the bearings are rotating smooth or not. It's a pretty rough assessment, so I moved on to disassembling the bike to gain access to each bearing. I removed the remainder of the air in the rear shock, the rear wheel, the brakes, and the derailleur. Then I removed the rear shock. And then I removed all of the pivot bolts. It's important to remember where everything goes as you do this so that you can easily put everything back together. I also removed the crank just to make it easier to access everything. My Rocky Mountain Slayer uses a pipe lock collet, which I had to tap out gently using one of the pivot bolts. Now that I had access to the bearing, I was able to rotate them with my fingers, and I noticed quite a bit of grit. So I pulled off the seal using a pick, and sure enough, I found quite a bit of dirty grease. I cleaned it with some solvent. In my case, I just used WD-40. Then I rotated the bearing to loosen up the grease and dirt. I did this a few times. Then I cleaned it up with some isopropyl alcohol and some compressed air. Once it was all clean, I pressed in some new grease. I just used some waterproof marine grease that I found at my local hardware shop. I also cleaned the bearing seal and then gently pressed it back in. It was definitely rotating a lot smoother, but now I take a look at replacing the bearings. I bought these bearings from Rocky Mountain and a bearing removal and press tool. The removal tools were all blind bearing pullers, which require hammering from the other side. I really wasn't comfortable hammering around carbon components. I opted to use the socket method. This involves using a smaller socket to press the bearing into a larger socket on the other side. Now I taped the ends of the socket to prevent any damage to the bike. This can damage the bearings, but since I'm replacing them, I really don't mind. If you're planning on reusing these bearings, you may not want to try this method. I definitely felt a lot more comfortable removing the sockets with this method. I did have to use the blind bearing puller for two of the bearings in the frame. As you can see, the bearing press tool is quite nice. It ensures the pressure is evenly distributed around the races of the bearing. This prevents any damage to the bearing as I press it in. This is how I use the bearing press tool. As I pressed it in, I ensured that it was tight and also flush. Here I am pressing the bearing into the frame and into the chainstay. Once all of the bearings are pressed in, it's finally time to reassemble everything. I applied a little bit of grease to all of the pivot bolts and a bit of blue Loctite to the threads to ensure that nothing seizes or comes loose while I'm riding. I also torqued everything according to the specifications outlined in the technical manual for my bike. Once everything was put back together and torqued, I put the derailleur back on, the rear brakes, the rear wheel, and then reinflated my rear shock to my usual pressure. Pressing down on the suspension, I could definitely notice an improvement. Much smoother. Having done brake bleeds, suspension maintenance, and drivetrain replacements, I'd have to say this process was pretty manageable, although definitely one of the more difficult tasks. If you're not comfortable doing it yourself, I highly recommend taking it to your local bike shop and letting the professionals handle it. Did I miss anything? Do you have a better method? Please let us know in the comments below and be sure to subscribe. Until the next episode, ride on.